I focused on was migration, human rights in democratic governance. Basically, my emphasis was to say, if you have a person who is a migrant, who has traveled at all stages at entry and when he's been returned or she's been returned back to the original country, international human rights standards must be applied, whether that migrant is a regular migrant or irregular migrant. And I emphasize to say the term illegal migrant is not entertained under the United Nations, and therefore either a migrant is undocumented or documented. Again, you have refugees, asylum seekers, and in all these, international human rights must be applied based on Universal Declaration 1948. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. As you can see in the agenda, my colleague AGOSS should have been here with me, or he should have come to do a presentation. He's from Sudan, but because of the commitment, then I'll take the responsibility to present to you what we had prepared. And given the remarks so far made, technology here. Okay. Given the remarks to say we have really to summarize, I'll try to give you a summarized summary. I never expected that you could have this short time, but I know there are others that will talk about the same topic, so there is no need to go into the nitty-gritty. I'll give you an introduction, and then I'll try to give you some categories and some definitions generally that have been used by academicians, institutions, and the like. And then I will provide some frameworks, in particular governance frameworks, because they do impact on migration and the way we have undertaken governance in Africa or different continents. Definitely that has had an impact as far as migration is concerned. Then, after those frameworks on democratic governance, I'll focus more on international human rights frameworks. So I'm trying to narrow down from democratic governance to international human rights standards. Then from those standards, I select a few, not necessarily a few, of course, some specific substantive rights that have been applied in the migration process. Then I look at returnees and reintegration as an aspect where the migrants have gone abroad, they come back, and they have to be reintegrated. And this reintegration is where the paper is focusing on, because there is little that has been developed so far. First and foremost, in terms of the introduction which you saw, basically the UN General Assembly adopted the Agenda 2030, and in that Agenda 2030, it profiled the international migration to put it into global perspective. So you notice that now migration has really gained currency. And this is not surprising, of course. It's because of the statistics. As for 1970 to 2017, you'll find that there were 82 million migrants. And in 2017, according to the sources, it's 244 million. And if you look at that figure alone, you find that the United Nations, global frameworks, and different regional bodies have started responding to this. But still, there is a question to say, why now? Because migration started some time back. And that alone, we have seen now the UN coming up with a global compact on migration, just to see how we can manage migration globally. But it has to be understood that the debate on migration became very difficult in early years, because the migrant receiving and sending states could not agree in terms of how they could bring this particular phenomenon into the United Nations. So it took a bit of, so when you're talking about governance, definitely, you can see from the origins, basically it has been a difficult thing. And therefore, migration remains a complex phenomenon at the moment. In terms of definitions, there are various definitions. And in the slide that provided a number of definitions, which I don't need to read for the sake of brevity and sanctity. Basically, you are talking a permanent shift or movement of people going beyond the borders, international borders. But within this debate, we have to be mindful of internally displaced persons as well, because it's important to understand those frameworks. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult sometimes to appreciate the application of human rights if you don't understand these concepts. Internally displaced persons are those that are just moving within the territory. And this brings me to international and human rights. Basically, the right to enter or remain in a member state, the discretion remains with the state, irrespective of international human rights that you have. So the state has discretion to allow you to enter and remain in a member state. It can refuse. However, what international human rights says is that in exercising control of the borders, states must always observe the international standards. So fulfillment of human rights, protection and and implementation must always be observed. Then within entry, once a migrant or a person has entered the territory, is the issue of jurisdiction. And usually jurisdiction, people interpret it as something to do with territory. But this is not the only case. According to a case, a ruling by European Court of Justice, basically you look at sea. If you are rescuing migrants or persons on the sea, if you have taken control of those people, you have effective control, you have the jurisdiction. If you are in the air and the space, you have that jurisdiction. And in that situation, you must apply human rights. That's the main message there. And finally, the principle there is that if a migrant has come into territory, there is prohibition for a member state to send that particular person to go to another state or member state where there is human rights violation. So it does provide a safeguard in terms of violation of human rights as far as so I will not stick to this, as I said. And then within this framework, Africa has adopted several frameworks. The Democracy Governance Charter, you have Agenda 2063. A lot of charters have been adopted by the African Union, and members do ratify that. But of course, there is a challenge in terms of implementation, some to accede to those particular treaties. So what happens, though we have had this democratic governance space, is that at the end of the day, because member states at times they have less commitment to those provisions, it becomes a problem to see how in practice they can work. I'm talking from the practitioner's point of view, having worked out on the field in the communities. And those frameworks have provided some provisions in terms of human rights. And now I come to international human rights frameworks. You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. Every human being has a right, irrespective of what. And within that, again, you have some socio-economic rights, which are promotional in nature and not mandatory. You have the civil and political rights, which are more aggressive in terms of application. But these frameworks are supported by regional treaties in order to achieve the rights. So all I'm talking about is that we have those frameworks which are governance, then the human rights governance specifically, and then when you extrapolate from those frameworks in international governance, you find that there are basic rights that can be applied to every migrant or a person who is deemed to be a migrant or even undocumented migrant. Now, as I'm talking about this, it's important to understand categorization of the migrants. One is that you have migrants who are undocumented, you have those who are documented, you have those who fall within the Refugee Act, and what international human rights standards will say is that in all these aspects, international standards must be observed. That's the key message, irrespective of what. So as they are moving these persons entering the state, whether they are coming back in return, you have to provide those safeguards and international protection. That's the main message within that. But there is caution. The United Nations doesn't entertain this term illegal migrants because you tend to criminalize individuals as they enter the state. Number two is the issue of when you are grouping them. Care has really to be taken, because today an economic migrant can end up a refugee. The other month, a refugee can end up to be an economic migrant. For example, if you have a refugee who was given status and that has expired because in the origin of the country where he came from or she came from, things have normalized, and continues to stay in that particular country, loses that status, it means that particular refugee or person becomes undocumented because the permit is over and so on. So these things we have to be very careful in academic circles as we write about migration, because really to divide where you end and where you begin sometimes can be a challenge. So categorization, grouping of these migrants can be something which we have to be very careful when we are applying international human rights. So things like right to life, you don't have to abuse anybody. The basic rights that you can have in the civil political rights, those rights ought to be applied to migrants, irrespective of how they have arrived in your member state, because of the universal human rights. However, I repeat, member states have the discretion for entry and remain, though the international standards require that you have to respect these rights which we are talking about. The final point, a migrant has gone somewhere and is returning. Obviously, even during the return, sending state and the receiving state, the country of origin, human rights need to be applied in all those stages. But there are some interesting elements that need to be taken account. And this is an area which is very important. I was at AU headquarters, AU, EU, United Nations Task Force on Libya. It's reintegration. So a migrant has come back in the community. At that level, you need to undertake reintegration. And the application of packaging of rights on reintegration remains a gap at the moment. So a lot of literature, papers that have been written, they have covered all application of human rights going, you enter and you come back. When a returnee comes in the community, to what extent can you apply those particular rights? So far, when they are building clinics, all these projects, from the legal point of view, you can translate that those are socio-economic rights. But also you create disparities, because as you are helping this returnee or others, they find other benefits which in a poor community they don't have. So at the end of the day, you create that particular discriminatory perspective to say a returnee has benefited by the packages because he has been retained on irregular. And sometimes you can also encourage migration to say, if I go, I come back, I can also benefit the same. So packaging and how you can apply reintegration at that level, looking at an individual, community, and the structural remains an issue. And this is the issue, again, at AU headquarters last week we are grappling with, because even the funders had a lot of questions whether they are achieving anything by giving some £2,000 a person going back. When he goes back in the community, he looks like he's better off and the community is too poor. How do they accept this? Another, fallacy is that when they're defining a community, it's like a community is homogeneous, but communities are different. Thank you very much.
I work for Public Affairs Committee. The name sounds very much governmental, but basically it's a civil society based in Malawi. But my role in terms of working in all these issues, in political affairs cluster of the AU ECOSOC, which is an organ of the African Union. So I've been involved in a number of areas, missions of the African Union, including migration, human rights, apart from these other international observation missions in the elections and the like. The topic I focused on was migration, human rights in democratic governance. It's a loaded topic. And in that topic, basically, my emphasis was to say, if you have a person who is a migrant, who has traveled, at all stages, at entry and when he's been returned or she's been returned back to the original country, international human rights standards must be applied, whether that migrant is a regular migrant or irregular migrant. And I emphasize to say the term illegal migrant is not entertained under the United Nations, and therefore either a migrant is undocumented or documented. Again, you have refugees, asylum seekers, and in all these, international human rights must be applied based on Universal Declaration 1948. Every human being has a right and the same dignity. So my emphasis was application of human rights at all levels. My recommendation was to package human rights at reintegration stage when a migrant has returned from where he went or she went, coming back to the community. How do you reintegrate that particular returnee in form of what packages of human rights you can give them, and what is it that you can also do to the community so that the community doesn't see helping a returnee is putting them at a disadvantage, because one would have benefits better than the community he is being or she's being reintegrated. So that was the emphasis of the paper in terms of interpretation, application of human rights at all stages. My view is that I think institutions must aim at projects or programs that empower the citizens so that they can make demands, because the relationship with leaders in traditional society is very vertical. But how can we create this demand horizontally for issues so that the member states can act on the issues which they sign or they agree within the African Union or with other regional bodies? So APRM has a role to do interfacing with the practitioners, civil society and the like, because just concentration on the academic side, I think you can lose completely, because the realities on the ground is completely different. And what sometimes is being written in academic terms, it doesn't really mirror the realities if you have been a practitioner at the community level, because the traditional state and the modern state, they clash, and they're fighting for that space. And that can be difficult to transform societies into democratic governance and indeed entrenching human rights standards. My view is that practitioners are very important to bring some practical challenges, and academicians and those professionals are also important to package the information which is coming from the practitioners in a manner that can resonate with other partners. So there has to be more cross-fertilization between practitioners and academicians. Otherwise, working in a boardroom now and again, analyzing issues without listening to practical problems can be a challenge. So that linkage should be sustained, and listening more to practical things. And this demarcation which is there to say academicians and practitioners, I think it's dying out, though we are maintaining it, because in actual sense, academicians are going to institutions that are doing practical work in today's world, and they put it into the books and so on. So really that demarcation, yes, it's being emphasized, but it's dying out in terms of the research which is being done. They meet practitioners in order to produce papers and the like. So to a certain extent, that has just to be harnessed and make sure that you tap more realities, and then the African Union will transform itself to those heights which we wish to see.